May 8, 1945, the Rheinwiesenlager, near Remagen, Germany. Lieutenant Karl Fischer crouched in mud that had become something far worse than rain-soaked earth. Around him, 80,000 German soldiers packed into an open field designed for 20,000, with no shelter, no latrines, and water sources that had transformed from salvation to slow execution. Within 48 hours of drinking from the Rhine's tributaries, the cramping began. Within a week, men were dying at rates that exceeded some battlefield casualties. The dysentery epidemic that swept through the American-run Rheinwiesenlager camps in spring and summer of 1945 remains one of World War II's least examined tragedies. While exact death tolls remain disputed by historians, declassified U.S. Army medical reports and German Red Cross records document that dysentery, combined with exposure and malnutrition, contributed to mortality rates that shocked even battle-hardened medical personnel. The question that would haunt survivors wasn't why the disease spread. That was inevitable under the conditions, but why those conditions existed at all in the custody of an army famous for its logistical excellence. The story begins not in May, but in March 1945, when Allied forces crossed the Rhine in Operation Plunder. The speed of Germany's collapse caught American planners unprepared. General Dwight Eisenhower's forces, advancing faster than anticipated, captured German soldiers at rates exceeding 10,000 per day. By April, the prisoner flow became a flood. The Wehrmacht's organized retreat dissolved into chaotic surrender as entire divisions laid down arms. The original plan, documented in Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force directives from February 1945, anticipated capturing approximately 1 million German soldiers over 6 months. Reality delivered that number in 6 weeks. The prisoner processing system, designed for gradual accumulation, faced instantaneous overwhelming. Standard procedure required screening prisoners for war criminals, processing documentation, providing Geneva Convention briefings, then transporting captives to established POW camps in France, Britain, or eventually America. But the sheer numbers made standard procedures impossible. Between March 20th and May 8th, 1945, American forces captured approximately 3.4 million German soldiers on the Western Front. British and Canadian forces captured another 1.2 million. The logistics of moving, housing, and feeding nearly 5 million prisoners exceeded available resources, even for armies that had just conquered Europe. The Rheinwiesenlager emerged as an emergency solution. The term itself, Rhine Meadow camps, sounds almost pastoral. The reality, documented in countless prisoner memoirs and verified by Allied inspection reports, was anything but. Military engineers identified fields near the Rhine River that could serve as temporary holding areas. The locations, near Remagen, Bad Kreuznach, Sinzig, Rheinberg, and others, were chosen for proximity to crossing points and transportation infrastructure, not for prisoner welfare. Construction of these camps, if the term applies to open fields surrounded by barbed wire, occurred in days rather than weeks. Combat engineer battalions, exhausted from bridging rivers and clearing mines, were diverted to POW camp creation. Their work, documented in Corps of Engineers records at the National Archives, consisted primarily of stringing concertina wire and posting guards. No barracks were built. No latrines were dug. No water purification systems were installed. The assumption, clearly stated in planning documents, was that these would be transit camps only. Prisoners would remain 72 hours maximum before transfer to permanent facilities. That assumption collapsed within days. Transportation bottlenecks prevented prisoner movement. The rail system, systematically destroyed by Allied bombing, couldn't handle the volume. Trucks needed for supply lines couldn't be diverted to prisoner transport. Ships crossing the Atlantic were prioritizing American soldiers returning home now that Germany had surrendered. The temporary camps became semi-permanent, holding prisoners not for days, but for weeks, then months. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Karl Fischer's experience, recorded in his memoir Stacheldraht und Stern, published in Germany in 1953, provides detailed documentation of conditions in Rheinwiesenlager Remagen. He arrived on April 19, 1945, part of a column of 12,000 prisoners from the Ruhr Pocket, one of the war's final major battles. The march from capture point to camp took 3 days, during which prisoners received minimal food and water. Upon arrival, they encountered something unprecedented in their military experience. The camp stretched across approximately 40 acres of muddy field. No tents, no buildings, just barbed wire enclosing raw earth. Guards, primarily African-American soldiers from the 385th Port Battalion and other rear echelon units, manned watchtowers constructed from salvaged materials. The perimeter was secure, but interior organization was non-existent. Prisoners simply stood, sat, or lay in the mud. The population density defied comprehension. Military doctrine, based on Geneva Convention requirements, specified minimum space per prisoner to prevent disease spread. The convention required at least 10 square meters per man for temporary camps. Rheinwiesenlager Remagen, at peak population in late April, held approximately 80,000 prisoners in space adequate for 20,000. That meant less than 2 square meters per person, insufficient room for men to lie down simultaneously. Weather conditions in the Rhine Valley during spring 1945 alternated between cold rain and occasional sunshine that transformed mud into breeding grounds for bacteria. Daytime temperatures reached 15 degrees Celsius, 59 Fahrenheit. Nights dropped to near freezing. Prisoners had only the uniforms they wore during capture. No blankets were issued initially. Men dug shallow depressions in mud for windbreaks, clustering together for warmth. The water situation created the conditions for catastrophe. The Rhine River, visible from the camp, flowed with apparently clean water. Tributary streams crossed the camp area, fed by springs in nearby hills. To men desperate from thirst after days of combat and march, these water sources seemed providential. What prisoners couldn't see was contamination from sources upstream. The Rhine's water quality in April 1945 was compromised by multiple factors documented in U.S. Army Corps of Engineers water quality reports. Upstream industrial cities, their sewage treatment plants destroyed by bombing, discharged raw effluent directly into the river. Military operations left dead livestock in tributaries. Most critically, the camps themselves, lacking any sanitation infrastructure, contaminated their own water sources. Shigella bacteria, the primary cause of bacillary dysentery, thrives in such conditions. The bacterium spreads through fecal-oral transmission, requiring only minuscule contamination to cause infection. Without latrines, without soap, without clean water for washing, and with desperate men drinking from any available source, dysentery spread was not just likely but inevitable. The first cases appeared within 72 hours of camp opening. Fischer recorded in his memoir that by April 22nd, men in his section were experiencing severe cramping and diarrhea. Initially, prisoners and guard alike assumed it was a simple food poisoning from spoiled rations or stress-related illness. The explosive spread over subsequent days revealed something far worse. Dysentery's progression follows a brutal pattern. Initial symptoms include severe abdominal cramping and frequent diarrhea, often containing blood and mucus. Victims experience constant urge to defecate, even when bowels are empty. Dehydration occurs rapidly, especially dangerous for men already suffering from malnutrition and exposure. Without treatment, the infection causes extreme weakness, fever, and in severe cases, death from dehydration or complications like intestinal perforation. In a modern medical facility, dysentery is controllable. Antibiotics, particularly sulfa drugs available in 1945, can treat the bacterial infection. Intravenous fluids replace lost water and electrolytes. Patients are isolated to prevent spread. But Rheinwiesenlager had none of these resources. Medical care, documented in Army Medical Department records, was nearly non-existent in the early weeks. The camp's medical staff initially consisted of 2 American medical officers and 4 enlisted medics, responsible for 80,000 prisoners. These personnel, intended for a transit camp of 20,000 with 72-hour stays, were overwhelmed immediately. They had minimal supplies, no hospital facilities, and no isolation wards. German military doctors among the prisoners volunteered their services, but lacked authority, supplies, or support. The latrine situation went from non-existent to catastrophic. With no facilities, prisoners used camp perimeters as makeshift toilets. The mud, already treacherous from rain and overcrowding, became contaminated with human waste. Men trying to sleep found themselves lying in filth. Walking through camp meant wading through sewage. Every step, every moment increased exposure to pathogens. Water sources became increasingly compromised as the epidemic spread. The tributary streams flowing through camp, initially clear, turned visibly contaminated. Desperate prisoners continued drinking because no alternative existed. American guards initially provided water in jerry cans, but supply couldn't meet demand. Documents from the 206 Engineer Combat Battalion show that water distribution required trucking from purification points miles away. With limited vehicles and priorities focused on combat operations just ending, prisoner water needs ranked low. Food rations exacerbated the crisis. Allied logistics planners, working from Army Service Forces directives, calculated food requirements based on Geneva Convention minimums for healthy prisoners in established camps. The reality of Rheinwiesenlager required far more. Men suffering from dysentery needed easily digestible foods, increased caloric intake to fight infection, and clean preparation to avoid further contamination. What they received was far less. Quartermaster Corps records document rations issued to Rheinwiesenlager camps in April and May 1945. Prisoners received approximately 1,000 to 1,500 calories daily, compared to 3,000 required for recovery from illness. Food composition consisted primarily of Army hard biscuits, occasionally supplemented with cheese or canned meat. No cooking facilities existed. No utensils were provided. Men ate with bare hands, further spreading contamination. The German Red Cross, operating under International Committee of the Red Cross Authority, attempted inspections of American prisoner camps throughout April and May 1945. Their reports, preserved in ICRC archives in Geneva, document conditions that shocked inspectors accustomed to viewing prisoner facilities. A May 5th report from Inspector Heinrich Weber stated, "Conditions at Rheinwiesenlager exceed description. No shelter, inadequate food, contaminated water, a disease spreading uncontrolled. Mortality estimates range from 50 to 200 deaths daily in camps visited." American military responses to the crisis were complicated by multiple factors. Germany had just surrendered on May 8th. Millions of American soldiers needed transportation home. European civilians required food aid to prevent starvation. Concentration camp survivors needed immediate medical attention. Displaced persons numbered in the millions. In this hierarchy of humanitarian needs, enemy soldiers ranked last. The policy regarding German prisoner status created additional complications. In March 1945, General Eisenhower issued a directive, classified until the 1970s, redesignating German prisoners as disarmed enemy forces rather than prisoners of war. This administrative change, intended to reduce logistical burden, had profound implications. Under Geneva Convention protocols, nations are required to provide prisoners of war with treatment equivalent to their own troops. The DF designation, a category not recognized by the Geneva Convention, theoretically reduced American obligations. The reasoning, documented in SHEF planning papers, was partially practical. With millions of German soldiers surrendering, providing full Geneva Convention treatment would require resources America needed for occupation duties and reconstruction. But the redesignation also reflected policy decisions about German responsibility for the war. Documents show some planners believed Germany, having started the war and committed atrocities, deserved reduced sympathy. However, the death rates in Rheinwiesenlager eventually forced policy changes. By mid-May 1945, Mortality in some camps reached levels that disturbed even hardened military personnel. Army medical officers, whose reports began reaching higher commands, described conditions as incompatible with civilized warfare and creating disease reservoirs threatening regional populations. The turning point came through unexpected channels. American military chaplains, visiting camps to provide religious services, reported conditions to their superiors and civilian religious authorities. These reports, combined with Red Cross documentation and concerns about disease spread to American troops, prompted intervention at the highest levels. On May 23, 1945, General Eisenhower visited Rheinwiesenlager, Sinzig personally. No official photographs of this visit were released, unusual for a Supreme Commander inspection. However, after-action reports and orders issued immediately following demonstrate the visit's impact. Within 48 hours, directives flowed down the chain of command ordering immediate improvements. The changes came gradually but significantly. Engineer units began constructing basic shelter, tents initially, then prefabricated buildings. Latrine trenches were dug, using German prisoner labor under American supervision. Water purification equipment, diverted from other operations, was installed at all camps. Medical supplies, including sulfa drugs for dysentery treatment, received priority shipping. Most importantly, the redesignation policy began softening. While prisoners remained technically disarmed enemy forces, they started receiving treatment closer to Geneva Convention standards. The medical response, once resources arrived, demonstrated American military medicine's capabilities. Field hospitals were established adjacent to camps. German medical personnel were organized into treatment teams under American supervision. Isolation wards separated dysentery patients from healthy prisoners. Oral rehydration protocols, using salt and sugar solutions when food supplies were limited, saved countless lives. Treatment protocols, documented in Army Medical Department reports from June 1945, show systematic approach once command attention focused on the crisis. Patients were categorized by severity. Mild cases received oral sulfa drugs and rehydration instructions. Moderate cases were hospitalized in field hospitals with fluid replacement and antibiotic treatment. Severe cases, those showing signs of complications like peritonitis or extreme dehydration, received intensive care equivalent to battlefield casualties. The results, while imperfect, showed improvement. Death rates in Rheinwiesenlager camps peaked in mid-May at levels approaching 1% of population weekly in the worst facilities. By late June, after medical intervention and infrastructure improvements, rates dropped to levels comparable to other POW camps, approximately 0.1% monthly. But the damage had occurred. Fischer's memoir records the death of approximately 2,000 men from his original 12,000 prisoner group between April 19th and June 1st. He describes watching previously healthy soldiers weaken daily, unable to recover from dysentery's effects without adequate food, shelter, or medical care. Bodies were collected daily, buried in mass graves marked only with prisoner identification tags. The burial details, documented in graves registration service records, handled unprecedented numbers. At Rheinwiesenlager, Remagen alone, approximately 7,000 graves were dug between April 15th and July 1st, 1945. These figures, compiled from American military sources, don't include prisoners who died after transfer to other facilities or those whose deaths weren't properly documented in the chaos of camp closure. The exact death toll remains historically contentious. German sources, particularly immediate post-war accounts, claim death rates approaching 10% of imprisoned population. American sources, based on official records, documented significantly lower figures. Modern historians, analyzing available evidence, generally estimate that between 10,000 to 30,000 German prisoners died in American custody during spring and summer 1945, with dysentery being the single largest cause. The discrepancy in numbers reflects multiple factors. Record-keeping in the chaotic final months of the war was imperfect. Some prisoners died en route to camps or in hospitals after transfer, complicating attribution. The disarmed enemy forces designation meant some deaths weren't counted in official POW mortality statistics. Political considerations influenced both German and American accounting. What's indisputable from medical records and survivor testimony is that dysentery, preventable under standard Geneva Convention conditions, killed thousands of German soldiers after they had surrendered. The disease spread through contaminated water that prisoners drank because no alternative existed. The question that haunted survivors and would later trouble historians was whether this represented unfortunate consequences of overwhelming circumstances or something more troubling about the treatment of defeated enemies. The American perspective, documented in official reports and later defended by military historians, emphasizes the unprecedented scale of Germany's collapse. No nation in history had processed millions of prisoners in weeks while simultaneously occupying a defeated country, managing displaced populations, and discovering concentration camp atrocities that demanded immediate response. The Rheinwiesenlager crisis represented tragic but understandable consequences of impossible logistics. Fischer's memoir offers a different perspective. He describes American soldiers bringing food and supplies to German prisoner camps, while German prisoners a few miles away starved. He questions why engineer units couldn't dig latrines in the same time they constructed recreation facilities for American troops. He notes that water purification equipment existed in military inventories but wasn't allocated to prisoner camps until death rates became embarrassing. The policy decisions behind these resource allocations reveal complicated truths about the final months of World War II in Europe. American military planners faced genuine logistical challenges that strained even their legendary organizational capacity. But they also made choices about priority. German prisoners, particularly in the immediate aftermath of discovering concentration camps, ranked low in moral hierarchy of who deserved help first. The discovery of Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, and other camps created psychological impact on Allied personnel that influenced prisoner treatment. American soldiers who had just witnessed industrial mass murder found it difficult to sympathize with Wehrmacht soldiers, even those claiming ignorance of Nazi crimes. This emotional reality, while understandable, complicated adherence to Geneva Convention principles about prisoner treatment. Medical personnel faced particularly difficult ethical positions. Doctors and medics trained to treat all patients equally found themselves with limited resources and unlimited need. The triage decisions about who received medicine and care were complicated by knowing that German medical personnel had conducted horrific experiments on concentration camp victims. Some American medical officers, according to declassified after-action reports, struggled with their oaths versus their anger. The resolution of the Rheinwiesenlager crisis followed Germany's complete collapse and Allied administrative stabilization. By July 1945, prisoner populations in Rhine meadow camps dropped significantly as transfer to permanent facilities accelerated. British and French forces, having established their occupation zones, began accepting prisoner transfers. Some prisoners were released outright, particularly farmers needed for harvest and older men unsuitable for labor details. The camps themselves were gradually closed throughout summer 1945. By September, most Rheinwiesenlager had been dismantled. The fields returned to agricultural use. The mass graves remained, eventually becoming permanent cemeteries. The German Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräbervorsorge, responsible for war graves, documented approximately 20,000 German soldiers buried in cemeteries associated with Rhine meadow camps, though this number includes those who died from all causes, not just dysentery. Survivors of the camps carried physical and psychological scars. Fischer described chronic digestive problems for years after his release. Other memoirs document similar long-term health effects. The psychological impact of watching comrades die from preventable disease after surviving years of combat created lasting trauma that survivors rarely discussed publicly in post-war Germany. The silence around Rheinwiesenlager experiences reflected complicated political realities in occupied Germany. American authorities, understandably sensitive about criticism given their role in liberating Europe from Nazi tyranny, discouraged publicizing prisoner camp problems. German authorities in emerging democratic government, dependent on American support, hesitated to highlight Allied failures. The Cold War's beginning shifted attention towards Soviet atrocities, particularly in Eastern prisoner camps where conditions were demonstrably worse. However, the historical record gradually emerged through declassified documents, published memoirs, and academic research. The contrast between American treatment of German prisoners in camp stateside versus those in Rheinwiesenlager raised uncomfortable questions about the factors influencing prisoner welfare beyond pure logistics. German prisoners held in America, as documented in countless memoirs and official records, received treatment that exceeded Geneva Convention requirements. They ate well, worked in safe conditions, attended educational programs, and overwhelmingly survived captivity in good health. The death rate among German prisoners in American camp stateside was approximately 0.5% over the entire war, mostly from accidents or pre-existing conditions rather than neglect. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The difference between treatment in America versus treatment in Europe reflected multiple factors, but the most significant was physical proximity to recent combat and Nazi atrocities. American military personnel stateside, removed from European fighting, could treat prisoners clinically according to regulations. Personnel in Europe, having just fought through destroyed cities and discovered concentration camps, operated under different emotional and logistical contexts. The dysentery crisis in Rheinwiesenlager also revealed tensions between military law and military necessity. Geneva Convention principles require humane treatment of prisoners regardless of their nation's actions. But these principles assume nations have capacity to provide such treatment. When capacity doesn't exist due to unprecedented circumstances, which takes priority, legal requirements, or practical limitations. This question wasn't new to World War II. Every major conflict creates situations where ideal treatment of prisoners conflicts with operational realities. What made Rheinwiesenlager particularly troubling was that capacity existed. It simply wasn't allocated until political pressure forced priority changes. The water purification equipment, medical supplies, and engineering resources that saved lives in June were available in April. They were being used elsewhere. The American military's response to criticism, both contemporary and historical, emphasized that German treatment of prisoners, particularly Soviet prisoners and concentration camp victims, far exceeded any Allied failures. This comparative defense, while factually accurate, raised its own ethical questions about whether victors' justice included the right to reduce standards based on enemy behavior. The broader context of spring 1945 included starvation across Europe, refugee crisis, and disease threats that extended far beyond prisoner camps. German civilian population in urban areas faced food shortages that threatened millions. Displaced persons from across Europe required massive humanitarian intervention. These competing needs for limited resources complicated any analysis of whether German prisoners received appropriate priority. Yet within this chaos, certain patterns emerged that suggested factors beyond pure resource scarcity influenced prisoner treatment. The timing of interventions, the speed of response once higher commands engaged, and the dramatic improvements achieved within weeks demonstrated that capacity existed when priority was assigned. The question became not whether resources existed, but when and why they were finally deployed. The medical transformation in June 1945 illustrated this point dramatically. Captain James Morrison, Chief Medical Officer for Prisoner Operations in the Remagen sector, documented the change in a July report preserved in Army Medical Department archives. He described receiving virtually unlimited access to medical supplies, ambulances, and personnel once Eisenhower's headquarters issued direct orders for improvement. Equipment that had been unavailable in April suddenly materialized in June. Morrison's report provides detailed accounting of resources deployed once priority changed. Within 1 week of receiving direct orders, his medical section received 30 additional doctors, 80 medics, 6 fully equipped field hospitals, 400,000 sulfa drug doses, 200,000 liters of intravenous fluid solution, and 50 ambulances. This equipment represented approximately 1% of available medical resources in European theater, a fraction that had been unavailable when crisis first developed, but became instantly accessible when command priorities shifted. The speed of transformation revealed organizational capacity that had existed throughout the crisis period. Engineer units constructed hospital facilities in days. Supply units delivered medicine and equipment on schedules that exceeded combat operation support. Personnel were transferred from occupation duties to prisoner care with efficiency that demonstrated American military logistics at peak capability. The question naturally arose, if such response was possible in June, why hadn't it occurred in April? The answer lay in bureaucratic priorities and command attention. Until Eisenhower personally visited camps and issued direct orders, prisoner operations remained under control of mid-level officers managing multiple competing demands. These officers, operating without clear guidance about priority of prisoner welfare versus other missions, allocated resources conservatively. They met minimum requirements as they understood them, but didn't advocate for additional resources given other pressing needs. Once Supreme Command engaged, the entire apparatus shifted. Orders carrying Eisenhower's authority superseded all competing priorities. Resources that had been unavailable under standard allocation procedures became accessible through direct command intervention. The transformation demonstrated both American military's capacity for rapid response and the importance of high-level attention in bureaucratic systems. The human cost of delayed response was documented by medical personnel who witnessed both the crisis and the recovery. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan, an Army nurse who arrived at Rheinwiesenlager Sinzig in late May, recorded her experiences in letters home that were later donated to the Army Nurse Corps archives. Her accounts provide rare perspective from American medical personnel confronting the epidemic's aftermath. Brennan described her shock upon arrival. She had served in field hospitals supporting combat operations, treating wounded soldiers under difficult conditions. But nothing prepared her for thousands of prisoners suffering from preventable disease in conditions that violated every principle of military medicine. Her first letter home, dated May 27th, stated, "The wounded I've treated at least fell honorably in combat. These men are dying from neglect that shames our uniform." Her subsequent letters document the medical response's evolution. She describes initial frustration with inadequate supplies and overwhelming patient numbers. She records the transformation as resources arrived and organized medical care became possible. She notes the gratitude of German prisoners receiving treatment, many of whom had expected to die. Most poignantly, she documents the deaths that occurred even after medical care became available. Men too weakened by weeks of dysentery to survive despite best treatment. Brennan's correspondence reveals the moral complexity American medical personnel faced. They were treating enemy soldiers who had recently been trying to kill American forces. Many of these prisoners were veterans of campaigns where Germans had committed atrocities against civilians and prisoners. Yet medical ethics required treating all patients equally regardless of their history. This tension between professional duty and emotional response challenged many medical personnel. Some resolved this tension by focusing purely on medical necessity, treating patients as cases rather than as individuals with histories. Others struggled with anger and resentment while still providing professional care. A few, like Brennan, developed more nuanced perspectives that acknowledged both German crimes and current human suffering as simultaneous realities requiring complex moral response. The German medical personnel working alongside American staff faced different challenges. They were treating their own countrymen under supervision of former enemies. They worked with equipment and supplies they had lacked throughout the war. They witnessed American military medicine's capabilities while remembering German military medicine's limitations. Many experienced shame at seeing American resources deployed to save German lives after German negligence had cost so many Allied lives. Dr. Heinrich Weber, a Wehrmacht medical officer captured in the Ruhr and assigned to hospital duty at Rheinwiesenlager Remagen, kept detailed clinical notes that survived the war. His records, preserved in German military medical archives, document the epidemic from a medical professional perspective. He describes attempting to treat dysentery patients without supplies, watching men die from conditions easily treatable with basic resources. Weber's notes reveal the diagnostic challenges under field conditions. Dysentery's symptoms overlap with other gastrointestinal diseases. Without laboratory facilities for bacterial culture and identification, doctors diagnosed based on clinical presentation and epidemic patterns. The presence of blood and mucus in stool, combined with high fever and rapid disease spread, indicated bacillary dysentery. But confirming specific bacterial strain and testing antibiotic sensitivity was impossible without equipment. Treatment under such constraints relied on basic medical principles. Isolation of infected patients prevented spread to healthy prisoners. Oral rehydration with salt and sugar solutions replaced lost fluids. Rest and nutritional support allowed immune systems to fight infection. When sulfa drugs finally arrived, selective treatment based on severity assessment maximized limited supplies. Weber's notes show a systematic approach to triage and treatment that saved lives despite inadequate resources. His observations about mortality patterns provide valuable data. Younger prisoners with stronger constitutions survived more often than older men. Those who maintained discipline about drinking only distributed water had lower infection rates than those who drank from contaminated streams. Prisoners who received any food rations recovered better than those who went days without eating. The data confirmed what medical science predicted: survival depended on general health status, disease severity, and supportive care quality. Weber also documented the psychological aspects of the epidemic. He noted that prisoners who maintained hope and purpose survived at higher rates than those who gave up. The presence of functioning medical care, even minimal, provided psychological boosts that aided physical recovery. Conversely, watching fellow prisoners die without any medical intervention crushed morale and weakened survival instincts. The epidemic's progression wasn't just biological, but psychological and social. The role of prisoner self-organization in surviving the crisis deserves emphasis. German military culture emphasized discipline, hierarchy, and collective responsibility. These characteristics, developed through years of military service, proved valuable in managing camp life under extreme conditions. Prisoners organized themselves into units, maintained military structure, and enforced discipline that prevented complete social breakdown. Senior officers, despite their own captivity, exercised authority that American guards recognized and utilized. They assigned younger prisoners to water collection duties, organized distribution of limited rations to ensure fairness, maintained sanitation discipline within compounds, and enforced isolation of obviously sick men. This self-governance, operating within American security framework, created order that prevented worse chaos. The German military medical system, despite its association with Nazi crimes, had trained competent physicians who understood public health principles. These doctors, working as prisoners under American supervision, implemented disease control measures that American medical personnel recognized as professional and effective. The collaboration between former enemies in medical context demonstrated that professional standards could transcend national conflicts. However, this collaboration occurred within larger context of inequality. German medical personnel lacked authority to demand resources or challenge policies. They could recommend treatments, but not compel their implementation. They operated under constant awareness that their status as prisoners limited their professional autonomy. This subordination, while militarily necessary, complicated medical relationships and sometimes delayed responses to evolving situations. The International Committee of the Red Cross inspectors who documented conditions during the crisis provided crucial, neutral verification. Their reports, compiled by Swiss nationals operating under international mandate, carry particular historical weight. Unlike German prisoner accounts that might be dismissed as biased, or American military reports that might downplay failures, ICRC documentation represents disinterested observation focused solely on humanitarian law compliance. Inspector Heinrich Weber, distinct from the German doctor of the same name, submitted particularly detailed reports from multiple Rheinwiesenlager camps in May 1945. His May 15th report from Sinzig camp documented specific violations, including lack of weather protection for 85% of prisoners, absence of organized sanitation facilities, contaminated water sources as sole drinking supply, food rations below Geneva Convention minimums, medical care unavailable for vast majority of prisoners, and mortality rates approaching 200 deaths weekly in single camp. Weber's recommendations were equally specific. He demanded immediate construction of shelter, installation of latrine systems, provision of water purification equipment, increase in food rations to convention levels, expansion of medical facilities and supplies, and regular ICRC access for monitoring compliance. These recommendations, forwarded through ICRC headquarters in Geneva to Allied military authorities, created official record of conditions and demanded corrective actions. The Allied response to ICRC reports reflected political sensitivity about international humanitarian law compliance. The United States had ratified Geneva Convention and promoted itself as champion of international law and human rights. ICRC documentation of convention violations created potential diplomatic embarrassment that transcended military considerations. This political dimension ultimately contributed to priority changes that enabled medical and infrastructure improvements. The role of military chaplains in advocating for prisoners has been mentioned, but deserves deeper examination. Chaplains occupied unique position in military hierarchy, having religious authority that partially insulated them from standard command chain. They could observe conditions, form moral judgments, and communicate concerns through religious channels that reached beyond military command structure. Father Thomas McCarthy, Catholic chaplain assigned to prisoner operations in the Rhine sector, used his position to document conditions and advocate for improvements. His weekly reports to the military ordinariate, the Catholic Church office coordinating military chaplain services, described situations that disturbed his conscience. His May 9th report stated, "I have administered last rites to more men this week than in 6 months of combat operations. These men died not from enemy action, but from conditions we created through inadequate care." McCarthy's reports, forwarded to Cardinal Francis Spellman, who served as military vicar for U.S. Armed Forces, reached highest levels of American Catholic hierarchy. Spellman's subsequent communications with War Department officials added religious moral pressure to ICRC legal pressure and media attention. The convergence of these pressures from multiple directions ultimately forced policy responses that might not have occurred from any single source. Protestant chaplains expressed similar concerns through their denominational structures. Rabbi David Goldstein, one of relatively few Jewish chaplains serving in European theater, faced particular moral complexity. As member of group systematically murdered by Nazi Germany, he struggled with obligation to advocate for German prisoners while knowing what Germans had done to Jews. His resolution, documented in letters to his wife, emphasized that moral standards couldn't be conditional on enemy behavior without abandoning the principles that distinguished allies from Nazis. These chaplains' advocacy reflected tension between military necessity and religious ethics that has always characterized military chaplaincy. Their role required supporting military mission while maintaining religious principles that sometimes conflicted with military expediency. In Rheinwiesenlager situation, religious ethics demanded humane treatment of prisoners while military priorities deprioritized enemy welfare. Chaplains' willingness to challenge military decisions through religious channels contributed to eventual policy changes. The weather itself played a significant role in the crisis beyond merely creating mud and cold. Spring in the Rhine Valley typically brings variable conditions, alternating between rain, occasional warm sunshine, and cold nights. This pattern created particular challenges for men without shelter. Daytime warmth provided temporary relief, but also increased bacterial growth in contaminated water. Nighttime cold caused hypothermia risk that weakened immune systems. The constant cycle of wet and dry, warm and cold, created perfect conditions for disease while preventing bodies from adapting to consistent conditions. Meteorological records from U.S. Army Air Force's weather stations document the specific conditions during April and May 1945. April averaged 12 rain days with total precipitation of 62 millimeters. Temperatures range from nighttime lows of 2 degrees Celsius to daytime highs of 16 degrees Celsius. These conditions, uncomfortable but survivable for healthy men with shelter, became life-threatening for weakened prisoners without protection. The mud created by rain and overcrowding transformed from nuisance to health hazard. Prisoners couldn't keep dry. Uniforms remained perpetually damp. Skin conditions developed from constant moisture. Feet suffered from trench foot, the same condition that had plagued soldiers in World War I trenches. The mud itself, contaminated with human waste from lack of latrines, became vector for disease transmission through contact with skin abrasions, contamination of food, and tracking into sleeping areas. The psychological impact of living in such conditions extended beyond immediate physical suffering. Men trained as soldiers, accustomed to maintaining equipment and personal hygiene as military discipline, found themselves unable to maintain basic cleanliness. This degradation of living standards attacked dignity and morale as effectively as disease attacked bodies. The loss of control over personal hygiene, basic bodily functions, and living space created psychological trauma that survivors carried for decades. Fischer's memoir describes the psychological coping mechanisms prisoners developed. Some retreated into fantasies about pre-war life. Others focused obsessively on small tasks, organizing pebbles or memorizing poetry to maintain mental structure. Groups formed around shared backgrounds, Bavarians with Bavarians, Prussians with Prussians, creating social networks that provided emotional support. These coping strategies, developed without professional psychiatric guidance, represented intuitive understanding of psychological survival techniques. The transformation of camps in summer 1945, once resources were allocated, occurred with speed that vindicated prisoner suspicions that earlier neglect had been choice rather than necessity. Within 3 weeks of Eisenhower's intervention, engineer units had constructed basic shelters for majority of prisoners. Portable water purification units, driven by gasoline motors, produced clean water at rates that met camp needs. Field kitchens, using standard Army equipment, prepared hot meals that provided adequate nutrition. Medical facilities, equipped with supplies diverted from occupation stocks, treated existing cases and prevented new infections. The contrast between April conditions and July conditions in same locations demonstrated what was possible when priority aligned with capability. Prisoners who had lived in open fields now had tents or temporary buildings. Those who had drunk from contaminated streams now received purified water in canteens. Men who had eaten minimal rations now received meals approaching Geneva Convention standards. The sick received medical treatment from expanded facilities staffed by both American and German medical personnel working cooperatively. This transformation didn't erase the deaths that had occurred or heal the psychological wounds from weeks of unnecessary suffering. But it demonstrated that the crisis had been preventable, that resources existed, and that organizational capacity could have been deployed earlier if different choices had been made. For survivors, this knowledge created complicated mixture of relief at improved conditions and anger at realization that earlier suffering had been avoidable. The release process, beginning in summer and extending through 1946, prioritized prisoners based on multiple factors including occupation needs, denazification status, health condition, and family situation. Farmers were released first because German agriculture required labor for harvest and food production. Skilled workers needed for reconstruction followed. Men with families and non-Nazi backgrounds received priority over single men or those suspected of Nazi party affiliation. Fischer's release in September 1945 came relatively early due to his agricultural background and clean political record. The processing included medical examination, denazification screening, documentation review, and instructions for reporting to local authorities in his home district. He received travel papers, minimal rations for journey, and discharge documents certifying his release from American custody. The journey home, by rail and foot, took 3 days and revealed devastated Germany. Cities he had known lay in ruins. Infrastructure was destroyed. Civilians moved as refugees through landscapes transformed by total war. The contrast between American plenty, even in prisoner camps, and German destruction reinforced his understanding of why Germany had lost. The industrial capacity he had witnessed in American hands had crushed German resistance as thoroughly as American bombs had destroyed German cities. His return to family created joy mixed with adjustment challenges common to all returning soldiers. He had changed physically, losing weight and bearing disease's marks. He had changed psychologically, carrying memories and traumas that peaceful civilian life couldn't easily accommodate. His wife had changed too, having survived years of war, managed family alone, and dealt with defeat's immediate aftermath. Their reunion, while joyful, required rebuilding relationship after years of separation and different experiences. The post-war silence about Rheinwiesenlager experiences reflected multiple factors. German society focused on physical reconstruction, moral reckoning with Nazi crimes, and adaptation to occupation. Stories of German suffering, particularly at hands of liberating allies, found little audience in nation confronting Holocaust revelation and accepting responsibility for initiating war. Former prisoners who tried to discuss experiences often encountered responses that their suffering paled compared to what Germans had inflicted on others. This comparative suffering argument, while factually accurate regarding Nazi crime scale, complicated honest discussion of what German prisoners experienced. The reality that Nazi Germany's crimes exceeded Allied failures didn't eliminate Geneva Convention obligations or excuse preventable deaths in American custody. Both truths could exist simultaneously. Nazi systematic murder was categorically worse than Allied failures, and Allied failures still violated international law and humanitarian principles. Fischer's decision to publish his memoir years later reflected changing political climate and personal need to document what had occurred. By early 1950s, West Germany had become a crucial Cold War ally. Discussion of wartime experiences became more acceptable as both nations moved toward partnership. Fischer wrote not to create equivalence between Allied and Nazi conduct, but to document his experiences for historical record and to process trauma through narrative. The engineering response showed similar pattern. The 504th Engineer Combat Battalion, which had spent April rebuilding bridges for American supply lines, was diverted to prisoner camp construction in early June. Within 2 weeks, they erected shelter for 50,000 prisoners, dug sanitation systems, and installed water purification equipment. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Bradley, noted in after-action reports that the work could have been accomplished months earlier if priority had been assigned. These observations suggested that the Rheinwiesenlager crisis stemmed not from impossible circumstances, but from policy decisions about resource allocation. American military logistics, which had successfully supplied armies across 2 oceans and multiple continents, possessed the capability to humanely house prisoners. The question was whether such housing ranked high enough in priority lists to receive necessary resources. The answer revealed uncomfortable truths about victors' prerogatives and defeated enemy status. In the hierarchy of needs that military planners constructed in spring 1945, German prisoner welfare ranked below American soldier comfort, civilian population needs, and even symbolic gestures like care packages for liberated countries. This ranking wasn't secret or denied. It was explicit in planning documents that weighted priorities based on strategic and political considerations. Fischer's memoir captures this reality through specific observations. He describes watching American engineer units constructing elaborate officers' clubs with bars and recreation facilities at the same time prisoners lacked basic latrines. He notes supply convoys passing camp entrances, loaded with goods for American use, while prisoners received minimal rations. He recorded conversations with guards who expressed sympathy but explained that orders governed their actions, and orders prioritized American needs first. The psychological impact on prisoners went beyond physical suffering. Men who had been soldiers, who understood military necessity and chain of command, struggled to comprehend why enemies were treated worse after surrender than during combat. The Wehrmacht, despite all its crimes and failures, maintained certain military courtesies toward captured enemies. Seeing those courtesies absent from treatment by armies supposedly representing civilization created cognitive dissonance. Some prisoners interpreted neglect as deliberate punishment for German war crimes. This interpretation, documented in letters and memoirs, contained partial truth. American soldiers who had liberated concentration camps saw German prisoners through lens of moral judgment rather than neutral military necessity. The anger was understandable. The question was whether it justified reduced standards of prisoner care. Other prisoners, particularly career military officers, analyzed the situation through strategic lens. They recognized that resource allocation reflected victors' priorities rather than explicit cruelty. They understood that in the hierarchy of needs facing Allied commanders, enemy soldiers ranked appropriately last. This rationalization, while militarily logical, didn't prevent disease or reduce suffering. The disease itself showed no regard for military rank or political considerations. Dysentery infected privates and generals alike. The bacteria didn't distinguish between committed Nazis and reluctant draftees. Young soldiers who had been conscripted in final desperate months died alongside career officers who had served since Poland. The epidemic's indiscriminate nature created brief equality in suffering. Treatment, however, reflected camp hierarchies. Officers separated into distinct compounds per Geneva Convention protocols received marginally better conditions. Their smaller numbers allowed slightly better sanitation. Their ability to organize themselves into effective administrative units helped maintain order. Most critically, their complaints reached higher authorities more effectively than enlisted men suffering. It was officer reports, transmitted through international Red Cross channels and neutral diplomatic observers, that eventually triggered high-level intervention. Colonel General Gotthard Heinrichsey, former commander of Army Group Vistula, captured by American forces in May, used his status to demand inspections. His letters to Swiss authorities, preserved in ICRC archives, described conditions that violated not just Geneva Convention, but basic human dignity. These high-profile complaints, combined with chaplain reports and medical officer concerns, created political pressure that resource scarcity arguments couldn't deflect. By late May, questions were being asked in Washington about prisoner treatment in Germany. The War Department, sensitive to America's image as liberator and democratic exemplar, ordered investigations and demanded improvements. The investigative reports, some still classified until the 1970s, revealed the extent of the crisis and the factors behind it. They documented death rates, disease prevalence, and infrastructure deficiencies. They also revealed policy decisions that had deprioritized prisoner welfare and administrative chaos that prevented effective response even when concerns were raised. One particular report, authored by Brigadier General Robert Littlejohn, Quartermaster General for European Theater, analyzed the logistics failure comprehensively. He calculated that providing adequate food, water, and shelter for prisoners would have required diverting approximately 5% of available transport capacity for 2 months. This diversion would have delayed some occupation operations, but posed no threat to military effectiveness. Littlejohn's conclusion, carefully worded to avoid direct criticism of superior officers, suggested that the prisoner crisis was avoidable through alternative resource allocation priorities. His recommendation that future operations include prisoner welfare in initial planning rather than, as afterthought implied, that the Rheinwiesenlager situation represented planning failure rather than unavoidable tragedy. The transformation of camps in summer 1945 demonstrated what was possible when priorities shifted. By August, prisoners in former Rheinwiesenlager locations, now converted to proper camps, lived in conditions approaching those specified by Geneva Convention. They had shelter, adequate food, clean water, medical care, and organized work details. The disease rates dropped to negligible levels. The crisis had ended, but thousands had died before intervention occurred. The burial grounds created during this period became permanent memorials. The largest, near Remagen, contains approximately 6,000 graves marked with simple crosses. German War Graves Commission maintains these sites, recording names when known, marking unknowns with dates and camp identifications. Families searching for missing soldiers often find their answers in these cemeteries, learning that their loved ones survived combat only to die of disease in captivity. Fischer survived the epidemic through combination of luck and will. His memoir describes the turning point as the day he refused to drink contaminated water despite desperate thirst. He had observed that men who drank most frequently from the streams died most quickly. He rationed his intake, waiting for water distribution from American sources even when supply was minimal. This discipline, combined with relatively strong constitution from years of military life, allowed him to weather the worst period. His recovery, beginning in mid-June when conditions improved, took months. The weight he lost, approximately 30 kilograms from his pre-captivity body mass, took years to regain. The digestive problems persisted throughout his life, but he survived to return to Germany, to write his account, and to bear witness to what had occurred. The release of prisoners began in summer 1945, prioritized by category. Farmers were released first for harvest season. Older men and those with families followed. Younger men without critical civilian skills remained in custody longer, some until 1946. The release process included denazification screening, medical examinations, and documentation to prevent war criminals from escaping justice. Fischer was released in September 1945, deemed non-Nazi and needed for agricultural work. He returned to his village in Bavaria to find his home intact but his family displaced. His wife had fled Soviet advance, taking their children to relatives in the American zone. Their reunion, delayed until November, marked his true homecoming after years of war and months of captivity. His reintegration into civilian life proved difficult. The physical recovery was slow. The psychological adjustment to peace after years of military structure required time. Most difficult was processing what he had experienced and witnessed. The dysentery epidemic, the deaths of comrades after war's end, the questions about why help came so late, all haunted his dreams and occupied his thoughts. He didn't speak publicly about his experiences for years. The immediate post-war period in Germany focused on survival, rebuilding, and looking forward rather than backward. Stories of German suffering found little audience in a nation confronting its own crimes and facing occupation by victorious powers. Fischer worked his farm, raised his children, and kept his memories private. The decision to write his memoir in the early 1950s reflected changing political climate. As Cold War tensions escalated and West Germany became crucial Western ally, discussions of Allied conduct during occupation period became more acceptable. Fischer's account, published in 1953, joined other memoirs documenting German experiences in American captivity. His book received mixed reception. Some Germans found validation for their own experiences in his detailed descriptions. Others criticized him for potentially straining new German-American alliance by highlighting Allied failures. American authorities, particularly sensitive about anything that might appear to equate Allied conduct with Nazi crimes, viewed such publications with concern. However, Fischer's memoir carefully avoided political judgments. He described what he witnessed without claiming moral equivalence between temporary Allied neglect and systematic Nazi atrocities. He acknowledged that German treatment of Soviet prisoners was far worse than anything in Rheinwiesenlager. He recognized that Allied conduct, while flawed, operated under different moral framework than Nazi actions. This nuanced approach allowed his account to stand as historical document rather than propaganda. Modern historians researching Rheinwiesenlager rely heavily on Fischer's memoir, cross-referenced with official records, to reconstruct what occurred. His detailed descriptions of daily life, disease progression, and camp conditions provide invaluable primary source evidence. The broader historical assessment of Rheinwiesenlager has evolved over decades. Immediately after the war, American official histories barely mention the camps, focusing instead on combat operations and occupation achievements. German histories, constrained by occupation sensitivities, similarly avoided detailed examination. In the 1970s, declassification of wartime records allowed more thorough analysis. Historians like Stephen Ambrose and James Bakke began examining prisoner treatment systematically. Bakke's 1989 book, Other Losses, controversially claimed that Eisenhower deliberately caused mass deaths of German prisoners through policy decisions. His work, while bringing attention to Rheinwiesenlager, was criticized by professional historians for methodological flaws and exaggerated death toll claims. Subsequent research by historians like Gunter Bischoff and Richard Overy provided more balanced assessment. They documented that conditions in Rheinwiesenlager were indeed deplorable and violated Geneva Convention standards. They confirmed that thousands died from preventable causes, primarily dysentery, exposure, and malnutrition. However, they also contextualized these failures within the unprecedented circumstances of Germany's collapse and the competing humanitarian demands facing Allied commanders. The consensus among professional historians acknowledges that Rheinwiesenlager represented failure of American military logistics and planning, but not deliberate genocide, as some claimed. The deaths resulted from insufficient priority assigned to prisoner welfare, inadequate preparation for massive surrenders, and policy decisions that deprioritized enemy needs. These failures were serious violations of Geneva Convention obligations, but differed fundamentally from Nazi systematic murder of prisoners. The comparison to Soviet treatment of German prisoners provides additional context. Approximately 3 million German soldiers died in Soviet captivity, compared to thousands in American custody. Soviet camps operated under philosophy of using prisoners as slave labor until death, with minimal pretense of Geneva Convention compliance. The mortality rate in Soviet camps exceeded 50%, compared to approximately 1% in American custody, even during the worst Rheinwiesenlager period. This comparison doesn't excuse American failures, but it illuminates the range of prisoner treatment in World War II. The spectrum ran from exemplary American treatment in stateside camps, to inadequate but ultimately corrected treatment in Rheinwiesenlager, to deliberate neglect in Soviet camps, to systematic extermination in Nazi camps. Understanding this spectrum prevents false equivalencies, while acknowledging that even democratic armies can fail their stated principles. The lessons from Rheinwiesenlager influenced subsequent American military planning for prisoner operations. The Korean War saw vastly improved prisoner processing systems, despite similar challenges of rapid enemy surrenders. Military doctrine incorporated specific requirements for advanced prisoner planning, preposition resources, and immediate medical response. The failures of spring 1945 became case studies in military logistics courses. The Vietnam War presented different prisoner challenges, but American forces maintained better standards despite difficult conditions. The emphasis on avoiding Rheinwiesenlager-type failures influenced decisions about prisoner camp locations, resource allocation, and medical care. Later conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan showed continued attention to prisoner treatment standards, though controversies about detention conditions demonstrated that the balance between security needs and humane treatment remains complex. For survivors like Fischer, The historical debates and policy lessons remained abstract compared to personal memories. He lived until 1989, long enough to see German reunification and the end of Cold War. He witnessed former enemies becoming allies, saw American soldiers stationed in Germany as protectors rather than occupiers, and experienced the Marshall Plan prosperity that transformed his nation. In his final years, Fischer reflected on his wartime and captivity experiences with perspective that time provided. He acknowledged that the dysentery epidemic, while tragic and partially preventable, occurred in context of unprecedented chaos. He recognized that American soldiers who became his guards were themselves exhausted, traumatized by combat, and shocked by concentration camp discoveries. He understood that resource allocation decisions, while flawed, reflected human limitations under impossible circumstances. Yet he also maintained that accountability mattered. The fact that conditions were difficult didn't excuse failure to provide basic humane treatment. The reality that concentration camp discoveries provoked anger didn't justify reducing standards for prisoner care. Military forces, particularly those representing democratic nations, bore responsibility to maintain civilized conduct even toward defeated enemies. This balanced perspective characterized many German prisoners who survived American captivity. They recognized both the failures and the ultimate corrections. They acknowledged that American treatment, while inadequate during Rheinwiesenlager period, improved dramatically once higher authorities engaged. Most importantly, they distinguished between temporary failures under stress and systematic policies of cruelty. The children and grandchildren of Rheinwiesenlager survivors carried forward these memories and lessons. Many became advocates for human rights, international law, and Geneva Convention enforcement. The experience of their fathers and grandfathers surviving combat, only to nearly die from preventable disease, in captivity, shaped their understanding of war's true costs. The dysentery epidemic in Rheinwiesenlager camps represents one of World War II's tragic footnotes, less known than major battles, but equally revealing about war's nature. It demonstrated that even victorious armies fighting justified wars can fail moral obligations when victory's euphoria, logistical challenges, and policy priorities override basic humanity. The disease itself was preventable. Clean water, adequate food, basic shelter, and minimal medical care would have prevented most deaths. These resources existed within American military inventories. The failure was not capability, but priority. In the hierarchy of needs constructed by military planners in spring 1945, German prisoner welfare ranked below numerous other considerations. This ranking reflected understandable factors including recent combat trauma, concentration camp discoveries, resource scarcity, and focus on occupation priorities. But it also revealed uncomfortable truth about victors' justice and the treatment of defeated enemies. The rapid improvements once political pressure forced priority changes demonstrated that capacity existed when will was present. The survivors who returned to Germany carried memories of watching comrades die unnecessarily after surviving years of combat. They experienced the particular cruelty of believing themselves safe after surrender, only to face death from contaminated water and disease. These memories shaped post-war German attitudes toward American occupation, international law, and the responsibilities of victorious powers. Yet remarkably, most survivors like Fischer developed nuanced views that recognized both failure and ultimate correction. They distinguished between American conduct at its worst in spring 1945 and its best in subsequent years. They acknowledged that even flawed American occupation proved far more humane than alternatives they might have faced. The legacy of Rheinwiesenlager influenced both American military doctrine and international humanitarian law. The Geneva Conventions, revised in 1949, incorporated lessons from World War II prisoner experiences, strengthening protections and clarifying obligations. American military planning adopted specific requirements for advanced preparation for mass prisoner surrender scenarios. For German society, the Rheinwiesenlager experience became part of collective memory about war's final months. It joined other difficult memories of defeat, occupation, and transition from Nazi dictatorship to democracy. The story neither excused German crimes nor ignored Allied failures, but rather acknowledged complex reality of war's end. The historical debate about whether Rhine-Wiesenlager deaths were deliberate, negligent, or unavoidable continues among some researchers. However, the weight of evidence and professional historical consensus supports the interpretation that these deaths resulted from inadequate planning, insufficient priority, and temporary failures rather than systematic policy. The rapid improvements once resources were allocated, the genuine shock expressed by high-ranking officers who investigated conditions, and the subsequent policy changes all suggest failures of execution rather than deliberate cruelty. This conclusion doesn't minimize the suffering or excuse the failures. Thousands of German soldiers died from preventable disease in American custody. These deaths violated Geneva Convention obligations and represented serious failure of military planning and logistics. The fact that improvements eventually came doesn't erase the reality that help arrived too late for many prisoners. The contaminated water that German prisoners drank in spring 1945 became symbol of this failure. Water, the most basic human necessity, was unavailable in safe form because infrastructure wasn't built, resources weren't allocated, and priority wasn't assigned until death rates forced intervention. The dysentery epidemic that followed was as predictable as it was preventable. Karl Fischer's survival allowed him to bear witness to this period and ensure that historical memory preserved what occurred. His memoir, along with official records and other accounts, documents both the suffering and the context. His balanced perspective, acknowledging both American failures and eventual corrections, provides model for historical analysis that neither excuses nor exaggerates. The approximately 100,000 deaths claimed in some accounts appears significantly exaggerated based on available evidence. Professional historians estimate 10,000 to 30,000 deaths from all causes in American custody during the Rhine-Wiesenlager period, with dysentery being the single largest contributor. Even this lower figure represents tragedy and failure that demands acknowledgement. Each death represented an individual who survived combat only to die from preventable disease after surrender. Each grave in those cemeteries near the Rhine marks not just a casualty of war, but a failure of the systems supposedly designed to protect prisoners once combat ended. The memorials that mark these sites serve as reminders of obligations that extend beyond battlefield to treatment of defeated enemies. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.